Have you ever, like me, have you ever thought to yourself, I was born in the wrong era? Or would you have liked to be born in a different era? Do you see yourself as being uh, out of out of touch with your times, and you would have preferred to have been at another time? I've often thought that in my life, reading books of various epochs and eras, and wondered what it would be like and loved to have lived in those times. Today, we are considering, following on from last week, in which we began the calendar, the biblical calendar versus the church calendar, and the importance of observing the biblical calendar and God's festivals, God's appointed times. This is what they are. They are God's appointed times. And so this is what we are considering now. And yesterday, we had a festival. And it's a festival which originates from the experiences of Esther and Mordecai in Babylon and during the Babylonian captivity. And Mordecai said the words, "Such a time as this," was in relation to Esther and Esther's request that he was making of Esther for her to approach the king. And so these words have stuck in my mind for many years, and they have given me a great deal of assurance and, I wouldn't say comfort, but reassurance when one feels purposeless or out of touch or insignificant or unimportant. These words can give one a lot of reassurance. So I'm going to get to that. Why these words give us so much reassurance, and the festival that stems from this time in history is the festival of Purim. And so Israel and Jews around the world have celebrated yesterday. In Shushan, the city where the king lived, King Xerxes, Hashvarush, he was the king who married Esther, and in his city, the festival was held for 2 days. That was because of a request from Esther. And so this festival originates from the circumstances that happened in Babylon at that time. And Purim, not a festival ordained by God. And so many would be saying, well, let me put it this way. Those who are more from the Christian theological perspective would be saying, oh, this is a Jewish thing, who cares? And we're not Jewish. And anyway, even if we were to observe the Jewish festivals, which are not Jewish festivals, they're God's festivals, which he says explicitly in his word. Even if they have an understanding of those festivals, they might be saying, well, Purim is not one of the festivals ordained by God, and therefore we don't need to worry about it. That is true from a legal perspective, from a religious observance perspective. But if we consider, as I mentioned last week, and I'll probably mention it over and over, the relevance or the significance of much of Jewish tradition that is not specifically ordained by God, yet fits the fulfillment or is fulfilled by Yeshua and by much of God's plan for the salvation of the world. Purim is just such a time. It is almost a model of Israel's history and what Israel would face. And it is, in fact, where we are now in the current history of Israel. And so Purim has two applications. The first is personal, and the second is national. It applies to both your personal experience and your personal relationship with God and walk with God or not, and the nation of Israel and Israel's experience and walk with God or not. So it points to both of those things and is applicable to both of those things. So in a nutshell, just to kind of sum up Purim, the book of Esther. And so traditionally, Jews around the world would read the book of Esther at this time of the year. They'd read, yesterday, they would have read the whole book of Esther. It's not a long book. I read it in 15 minutes this morning. It's only 10 chapters, so many pages. It's the one book of Scripture. It's a whole book in Scripture dedicated to this event in the history of Israel. In the whole book, not a big book, but in the whole book, God is not mentioned once. And so some have questioned whether Esther should even be in the Scriptures. Based on what I'm going to share with you this morning, there's no doubt in my mind that it most certainly is the Word of God. It is, God has said that He makes the end known from the beginning, and there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed. And the book of Esther reveals so much about the experience of Israel and our own experience. So I have no doubt that it is most certainly part of the inspired Word of God. So God is not mentioned. However, God is very much there. And I don't think there's anyone who reads Esther that does not recognize God in the story, in the experience, in the events that unfold at that time. And so the tradition of Israel, the tradition of the Jews around the world at Purim is to dress up in fancy dress. Not fancy dress as such, but anything goes, any kind of costume. Not fancy dress as in going to a ball and you get up in your finest finery, but fancy dress as in you dress up as a clown. I saw someone dressed up as a dinosaur. Someone at the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, the most holy site in Judaism, in a Spider-Man outfit. So unfortunately, I don't have any outfits, so I couldn't dress up for you today. The point of the dress up is to illustrate the hidden intervention of God at Purim, the hidden engagement of God in the affairs of the people at the time of Esther and Mordecai and Xerxes or Achashvarosh. He was the king. So God was there and God was involved. Even though he's not mentioned, there's no question that he was involved. And I just made a very brief list, and I'm going to go through this just as an indication. Just quickly, a brief overview of the book of Esther. Esther and Mordecai are part of the exiled nation of Israel when they were conquered. They were conquered by Nebuchadnezzar and taken off to Babylon. And this is now later down the line where a new king, a Persian king, Achashvarosh, has taken over, and he has had a party. He's had a 180-day celebration to really brag, to show off his strength, his wealth, his power. He is the king of the world empire. at that stage. And so he has this party to show off his power and his riches, and he then calls for his wife because she is the most beautiful creature, and he wants to show her off in her crown and her splendorous robes, and she refuses to come. And so he is furious, and he consults his wise men and what should be done, and so she's banished. And then he's distraught. After that, he kind of comes to his senses, and then he's really it doesn't say so explicitly, but the response of his subjects indicates that he must have been showing signs of being in remorse, and they say to him, "Let us go through your kingdom, find all the beautiful girls, and bring you a new wife." And so this is what they do. Esther, a young Jewish girl from Israel, is an orphan. Her parents have died, and her cousin Mordecai, who's much older than her, takes her under his roof and raises her like one of his own children. And so she is this beautiful young Jewish girl who is then chosen as one of the girls to go into a year-long process of beautification before she has an audience with the king, so that he can choose from this whole host of beautiful girls who he would like to be his wife. And so he then chooses Esther. Mordecai has has a job in the palace, so he's allowed in the palace, and so he can keep an eye on Esther, and he sits in the gate of the palace, and he overhears two of the king's servants conspiring to kill the king, and so he sends a warning to the king, and he prevents the death of the king. Subsequently, one of the king's men, noblemen, leaders, rises up in the ranks, and he promotes him to his second in command. So he's the next most powerful king, next most powerful person after the king. That is Haman. When we say Haman, we clap and make a noise and shout and scream and go crazy, because it's a name that would rather not be heard and should be the reason for that is that God said when the Amalekites were wiped out, that they would be wiped, their memory would be wiped from the earth. Haman is his ancestry can be traced back to the Amalekites. And so in Israel, the name, although it has to be spoken because we have to tell the story, would rather not be heard and not spoken and not remembered. We want it to be wiped off the record books, but to tell the story, it needs to be said. So Haman, he was promoted to second in charge, and he hates the Jews. And he hates Mordecai in particular, because Mordecai, like Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, refuses to bow down to Haman. So the king had ordered that Haman, being second in command, needed to be honored and respected, and everyone needed to bow down to him. And so Mordecai refused because he bows down to no one but God. And so Haman hates the Jews, but he hates Mordecai in particular. And so he plots for the death of all the Jews. And he convinces the king to sign a decree to allow him to destroy by murder all the Jews in the kingdom. And so, starting with Mordecai, he wants to kill all the Jews in the kingdom. And so Mordecai and all the Jews get to hear about this. So the decree is posted up everywhere. And so they are distraught. And Mordecai goes to Esther. Being the queen, she has access to the king, and that is their only hope to be delivered from this decree. And so he confronts her. And when he confronts her, he says to her in his in his plea to her to go to the king, she is distraught because she knows that if you go to the king uninvited, chances are you will be put to death. This was the nature of that king, of kings in general at that time in history, but certainly this king was clearly a vicious king who, I believe Xerxes was, if you've seen the movie 300, where the Leonidas, the king of the Spartans in Greece, his 300 men who oppose the Persian king who comes against Greece. I believe it is the same, that very king, Xerxes, Achashvarosh. So he was a ruthless king, and Esther knew that if she approached him uninvited, he could very well likely kill her, have her killed. So she was hesitant. She didn't want to do it, but Mordecai was insistent, and he says to her in Esther chapter 4 verse 13. Mordecai told them to reply, because it was through the messengers. Do not think in your soul that you will escape in the king's household more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Who knows whether you have attained royal status for such a time as this? Esther sent to reply to Mordecai, go gather together all the Jews who are in Shushan and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast in the same way. Afterwards I will go into the king, even though it is not according to the law. So if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai left and did all that Esther commanded him. So Esther then agrees to do this, though she might perish. And Mordecai, in his appeal to her, says to her, how do you know that you were not brought into royalty for such a time as this? And this brings me to, okay, well, let me give you the rest of the summary of the story. But this brings me to God's presence in this event, in these circumstances. So the rest of the story, Esther goes to the king. She doesn't just kind of blurt it out. She goes to the king. He invites her in, and so she's safe. She has been invited to speak with the king, and she asks the king to come to a banquet that she has prepared for him and for Haman. First night they go, he asks her, what would you like? I'll give you half my kingdom, anything you ask me. And she says, come back. I'd like you to come to another banquet tomorrow. So it comes the next day they come. In between, the day between, Haman has decided, okay, well, we'll get to that just now. The end of the story is Esther reveals to the king that Haman is plotting to kill the Jews, but she doesn't do it like that. She says to the king that there is a man who is plotting to kill me. The king doesn't know that she's Jewish. In all the time that she has gone through the process and been chosen and been wedded to the king and become the king's bride and become the queen of the empire, not once did she reveal that she was Jewish. So he didn't know that she was Jewish. And she says to him, there is a man that wants to kill me and my people. And of course, the king's immediate response is his wife, his queen, who dares to plot to kill. And he says, who? And she says, this Haman. And so he decrees another decree in which he cannot revoke the first decree, because to do that would be, first of all, it was against Persian law. The law most likely came about because of the reverence with which they held the king. So for the king to revoke a decree that he had already given and signed would be an acknowledgement of a mistake. The king does not make a mistake. He's next to God, and so he can't just revoke what he's already said. And so he writes out a new decree, which gives the Jews authority to defend themselves against any attack that might come against them, which they do. So that's kind of a very brief summary of the story. I encourage you to read the book of Esther. It's a fascinating story. I've just made a list of a few of the things that reveal the hand of God, the presence of God in the story, because they couldn't have been manipulated by the minds of men or the planning of men. So the first one really is the relationship of Esther and Mordecai. The fact that Esther's parents had died and Mordecai took her under his wing, and their relationship in their household. Then the choice of Esther by the eunuchs who went around to select girls to come and be beautified. The choice of Esther, in other words, really essentially her physical beauty. They were selecting young virgins who were beautiful. And so her physical beauty came from God. Her purity, that she had not yet been defiled by man. That was a preservation. It was part of Jewish law, Jewish custom. But in that age, especially as the lowest of society, anything could happen. And so her chastity and her beauty were gifts of God. It were things that no one can do for themselves. Those are things really that are a gift of God. Mordecai's employment in the palace, that gave him access to Esther, and it gave him access to hear the conspirators who were plotting. Being at the right place at the right time, that was an act of God. That is something that secular people would call chance. I don't believe in chance, and I don't believe in coincidence. I believe everything is in the hands of God, in control of God. And so these things that we think are just chance are really the hand of God at work, positioning us in the right place at the right time. So Mordecai, overhearing the conspiracy, the reward was overlooked. When Mordecai warned the king through Esther, he wrote it in his book, but he never followed up on a reward for Mordecai. So the fact that the reward was however, if his mind was somewhere else, or he was busy, or however he overlooked the rewarding Mordecai for what he did to warn the king of imminent death, that was overlooked. That itself is the hand of God, because after the dinner with Esther, the first dinner, the king could not sleep. And so he went to his journals and he read through, and he came across the entry in which he had written about the warning from Mordecai. And he asked his servants, has Mordecai been rewarded for what he did for me? And they said no. And so the very time, there was that one day, Haman had built a gallows next to his house to hang Mordecai. And so that day, between the meals, he had gone home and he had bragged to his family, his wife and his men, about how special he is, that in all the kingdom, Esther had only invited him, no one else. The next day, he was on his way and they then said, yes, you're wonderful. Tell the king he must give you Mordecai so you can hang him. So he had the gallows, and the next day he was going to the king to ask him if he could hang Mordecai, if he could have Mordecai. It so happened that that night the king had gone through his journals and he wanted to honor Mordecai. So when Haman got to the palace to ask, before he could get to ask, the king asked him, what should the king do for someone he would like to honor? Haman thought, well, he must be talking about me. Who else in this kingdom would he want to honor but me? And so he made this elaborate display of how the man should be honored. And so the king says, you go, because he had said, one of your highest nobles must lead him around the city on your horse, wearing your gowns, and proclaim the honor. And so he says to Haman, you go and you find Mordecai and you do what you have said for Mordecai. So the man that he wants to kill, he now has to lead through the city, honoring him, praising him. This is the timing, is the hand of God. So the king's insomnia was the hand of God. The timing was the hand of God. And then Esther's favor with the king was the hand of God. He could have had her killed. He could have been upset. He could have been in a bad mood and just been upset. But he welcomed her in and asked her what she wanted. And so her favor with the king was part of the hand of God. And so all of these things, the timing and how everything just worked out, we see the hand of God at work in redeeming Israel, redeeming the people of Israel. And so the two things, this is now my closing statements. The two things that I mentioned at the beginning that Purim really touches on, the personal application of Purim for each individual, and the national application of Purim for Israel. So first, the personal application I get from what Mordecai said to Esther, for such a time as this. And if we look at all those things that occurred, particularly the circumstances around Esther's relationship with Mordecai, the loss of her parents, her physical beauty, her chastity, all of these things, we could say that her entire life's experience from the day she was born all helped to facilitate where she found herself eventually in the king's palace. And so these her life circumstances, were orchestrated by God for arguably one day of her life. 2 days. She took 2 days to tell the king what the problem was. But it was for that moment that she could confront the king on the fate of Israel. And so we can deduce from that there may be I would say, I have always said, I have believed that even if you only have one thing to do in your life, there's only one thing that God has planned for you to do, one significant thing, or maybe even an insignificant thing, it makes your whole life worth it. Apart from that, we understand, those who believe in the God of the Bible, in the scriptures, we understand that we are made, all humanity Adam and Eve originally were made in the image of God. All humanity has a degree of the image of God. That is why the scriptures say that God does not take delight in the death of his enemies, because they are human beings who have in them a degree of the image of God still. Though that image has been marred by sin, by the fall, by Adam and Eve, and subsequently sin throughout the ages, we all are inclined to sin. Our hearts naturally inclined to sin. And so that image is marred, yet we still carry a degree of the image of God in us. And so by the very virtue of the fact that we are human beings, we have value. If you cannot contribute anything to society, if you are a quadriplegic in a wheelchair without the ability to use your hands or your feet, and you feel you are not contributing anything actively towards society, and you feel like you are worthless, you feel like you are a waste, there is nothing further from the truth. Every single human being, no matter what they contribute or don't contribute to society, has value simply because we are human beings created by God, and we still have a degree of His image in us. Then we might think we're not doing anything for God. There may be your purpose may not be something that you are ever consciously aware of. You may fulfill your purpose without even knowing that that was it. The only reason Esther might have known that this event and her part in it was of any significance may be the fact that Mordecai told her so. Certainly it was a major part that she had to play in bringing about the salvation of Israel, the deliverance of Israel from death by Haman and his evil scheme. However, every one of us has a purpose, whatever that purpose may be. If that purpose is simply to raise your children in the best way that you possibly can, to establish in them the abilities and the talents and the experiences and the foundation for what they will need to achieve, and they have a higher purpose than you might think your purpose was, you share in their achievements because you brought them to it. And so we could go on and on and on evaluating the different purposes there may be in life. But as I said, you may not even be consciously aware of what your purpose may be. You just live your life and do what you need to do every day. And in the process, unawares, you achieve your purpose without realizing that you've done it. And so everyone has value, everyone has purpose, a purpose. And so we should not be in despair. We should not be in depression or in anxiety over what we should do. We should cling to God and seek to honor and obey Him to the best of our ability. And if our purpose is never consciously revealed, then perhaps it's not necessary for us to know, and we have achieved it or will achieve it without even realizing it. That's a good thing in itself, because then we never become proud or arrogant about who and what we are and how special we think we might need to be because of what we've achieved. So not understanding or knowing consciously your purpose could be a very good thing. Then, in closing, the national aspect of how this applies to Israel. So throughout Israel's history, it has essentially experienced the same thing. Today, and I won't go through all the history, I'll just deal with today, because today we have the war in Gaza, we have the world upside down, we have the accusations leveled at Israel, which are in fact what Hamas is doing. I find it incredibly significant that Hamas is so close to Haman, the evil schemer who wanted to destroy Israel, and Hamas is obviously the controlling faction in Gaza. So Haman, the word means, well, no one really knows exactly what it means. There's some speculation about what it may mean and words it may come from, but the major meanings that have been ascribed to Haman are unique, magnificent, illustrious, certainty, sense of certainty, and trustworthy. So the person, Haman, was very much contrary to the meaning. These meanings are good, but the person was very much contrary to those. And so I find that in itself very interesting. Hamas, the word, the name for the controlling faction in Gaza, originally comes from the acronym for the Arabic phrase, which means Islamic Resistance Movement. So they were the resistance movement. HMS is the acronym HMS for the Arabic words, which mean Islamic Resistance Movement. And then the word itself, I believe that they put the vowels in there to make the word Hamas, which is the Arabic word for zeal, strength, or bravery. So they probably want to be known for those qualities, for zeal, strength, and bravery. Again, like Haman, the reality is something different. That's what they would like to be, but what the reality is something very different to what the word means. It's interesting that the Hebrew word Hamas means violence. And so it's the negative connotation. If we took zeal, strength, and bravery from a negative perspective, it would be aggression or violence. So Hamas, Haman, the names, and the reality is very much the same. What Haman represented was an active genocide. He explicitly and consciously and actively desired and nearly implemented, got the king to write the decree to implement a genocide, the destruction of a national people, of an ethnic group, simply because of their ethnicity. That is the definition of genocide. The word genocide was coined by a Jew after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, of two words, Greek and Latin words, genos and side. I think the word is, I don't know how it's pronounced, meaning genetics, ethnicity, and death. So it's a word that specifically refers to the killing or the death of an ethnic group, which is exactly what the Holocaust was. Hitler had a desire to kill the Jews. Haman had a desire to kill the Jews. Hamas desires to kill the Jews. The Iranian regime, the Ayatollahs, they have declared over and over that the intention is to kill the Jews, not to have a Palestinian state, not because they've been unfair to the Palestinians, not because they stole land from the Palestinians. Not all of these are simply propaganda to get the rest of the world to join them in their mission to kill the Jews. And so, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, means there will be no Jews there. It's not about the Palestinians need a home, they need land, and so if Israel would just be nice and kind and go back to the two-state solution, everyone will be happy. That's not the intention at all. All of that is just a ruse to get soft-minded Westerners to join the parade and get rid of the Jews. So the worse that they can make the Jews to be, the more the West will support them and oppose Israel. And this is, I see in the story of Esther, the story of Mordecai and Haman, I see the same thing that we see in Israel today. We have a ruthless, bloodthirsty, genocidal group, people who want to destroy another people, the Jews, drive them out, kill them, destroy them, get rid of them. And we have the Jews who are defending themselves. Xerxes, Ahasuerus, the king, at Esther's time, he made a declaration that the Jews could defend themselves. As I said, he couldn't reverse what he had already declared, and so he made another declaration that the Jews could defend themselves. And so they did. They defended and they defeated those who came against them, those who wanted to destroy them, those who were their enemies. They defeated them. And it was a harsh time and harsh people, and the same is true today. It's a harsh time and they're harsh people, and the West has got soft because peace and tranquility and a good life makes you soft. And so the ideals of brotherly love and everyone living together and all races coming together and accepting one another, these are all good ideals which we would long for and hope for, but they're not ideals that are a reality in the Middle East. In the Middle East, we still have very, very harsh, difficult people, difficult to deal with, get along with. And so we have a very aggressive group wanting to destroy another ethnic group. And so therefore this ethnic group has to be equally aggressive to defend itself. And the world looks on and thinks, well, this group is just savage, and if they will just be nice and kind, then this group will also just, they'll get along. And it's just not working. It won't work. It cannot work like that. And so Israel is defending itself against a genocidal ideology. And the world looks on and says, Israel is engaged in genocide. And so we have what Isaiah warned about in Isaiah 5 verse 20. Woe to them who call evil good and good evil. It's upside down. Israel, like always, like all the wars that have been fought in Israel since 1948, Israel has to defend itself. It is every government's responsibility to defend its people. If that means war, then that's what you have to do. If your neighbors are so intent on killing you that they are attacking you with missiles and knives and sticks and stones, you have to send your army to push them back, to defend your people. That is the responsibility of every government, and no government in the world would question that or refuse to do that. Only Israel is being told by the rest of the world that they must hang back. And so Purim, this year for me, Purim is more profoundly significant than it's ever been before, because this is where we find ourselves. We find ourselves in a time when good is being called evil and evil is being called good. So, Chag Purim Sameach. Happy Purim yesterday. And we're heading towards Pesach, so we look forward to that. New Year's on the 31st of the month, which will be a holiday in the millennium. So Ezekiel, I forget which chapter and verse Ezekiel tells us, but Ezekiel tells us that the first of Aviv, what became known as Nisan, is known as Nisan on the Jewish calendar today. The Babylonian name for the name God gave it, Aviv, which means a sprouting spring. That little the first two leaves that sprout when a seed germinates. Aviv, new life, sprouting. That's the beginning of the year, and that day will be a celebration in the millennium. And then 14 days later is Pesach, Passover. And so we look forward to that. Amen, amen. Shabbat shalom.